We are back looking at 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at with our hands, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. So, yesterday I went on this long background about the Gnostics and how they're this aberrant group, heretical group, non-Christian group that was trying to infiltrate the early church. And John, the Apostle John, writes to shut them down, to warn people about this idea of Gnosticism that is creeping in. I bring this up, I go here in this whole series, How Do We Know What We Know? Because there is, in the last 15 years, there's been all this talk about the Gnostic Gospels. And there's been a lot of concern about why certain books didn't make it into the New Testament. So there's also a podcast on this. We had a Lake Light talk by Dr. Dana Harris, professor. I think she chairs the New Testament department at Trinity. And so she gave a Lake Light lecture, and then I interviewed her. And so there's a podcast that looks into the whole formation of the New Testament canon and how it is that we got the books in there. So the two issues here when it comes to getting the New Testament. Old Testament is easier because we have the Old Testament that the Jews had. We have the Old Testament that was Jesus's Bible. Phil Yancey wrote a book called The Bible Jesus Read. He's talking about the Old Testament. So that's set, that's locked in, it's established. The 400 years before Jesus shows up, the canon, so the right books, the collection of books that make up the Old Testament, was agreed on and endorsed by Jesus. How do we get the New Testament canon? And it is a process of inspiration, getting the right words on the page, the dual authorship of God and the human authors, and then canonization, making sure the right books make it into the Bible. So there's been this talk in the last 10 years. I honestly didn't get questions about this or pushback about this early when I was a pastor, but it sort of emerged after Dan Brown wrote his book, The Da Vinci Code. And in it, he claims that the apostles tried to keep certain books out. They tried to suppress these other books that were going to get in because they didn't like them. And that none of this, then a whole lot of things sort of goes underground until Constantine wants to pull things together, and this is 300 years later, and that the New Testament doesn't reflect what actually happened. It's history being written by the winners, and so there's all this sort of scandalous stuff. And so when the Da Vinci Code came out, I actually gave a talk about it and wrote some things about it because it was just so misleading. So look, there was a process, a Holy Spirit superintended process by which the right books made it into the Bible. And the church never votes to endorse certain books. It recognizes books. So for the first 300 years, you got to remember, it was illegal to be a Christian. The Romans were trying to wipe out Christianity. So the early church leaders could not come together and meet from all over, Europe and get together and have a meeting. They couldn't talk with each other. The church was underground. To be a Christian meant that you could lose your job, lose your house, get fed to the lions, thrown in prison, whatever. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening underground. When they met, and Brown is right, Dan Brown is right, that there is a formal letter that comes out called the Easter Letter in like 367. And it reflects, it's the first time we have writing, because remember, we don't have a lot of writing happening back then, and we don't still have it, but it reflects, that letter reflects the 27 books that make it into the New Testament. And it reflects back on what was agreed upon at the Council of Nicaea, which was called by Constantine, in Nicaea, which is where his summer home was was at. Eventually, he's building Constantinople at the time, which will eventually be Istanbul. But they get together and they all agree. So all these leaders of the church get together for the first time because they can now meet openly. Constantine has made it legal to be a Christian. And so they've come together for this meeting. They're talking about the Arian problem, but they also say, yes, we agree on the same books. These are the books that were written by an apostle or endorsed by an apostle. So, for instance, Peter influenced a lot of Mark's work, and Luke is being influenced by Paul. So there are books written by an apostle or by somebody close to an apostle. There are books that were written very early and in circulation and accepted by the church. And then there are the books that had the self-authenticating voice of God, and that's sort of established and confirmed by the fact that the Christians living on their own all agree on these books. These are the books that we found helpful. Now, this was news to Dan Brown, not news to anybody else. Dan, have you paid attention in high school or you gone to college and taken some religion classes? You would know there were all these what we call pseudepigraphal books. Pseudo meaning false, pigrapha meaning writings. All these false writings that emerged in the 2nd and 3rd century. And they emerged at a time when, again, you got to go back 2,000 years. But the way to win an argument was to say, look, I just found a letter written by Mary, written by Peter, written by Thomas, written by Judas, all these Gnostic Gospels, and they say what I was saying. The Gnostics put a lot of these in circulation. We've known about them forever. We discovered a new trove of them in 1945, but they've been around. They've been around. There's no conspiracy here. They're just bad. So, 2 things I want to say. John is writing against the Gnostics. The Gnostic Gospels didn't make it into the New Testament canon because, one, they're heretical. John is writing against them, right? They claim that Jesus didn't come. They deny the incarnation. They deny the Trinity. They got all these weird views. Especially they got weird views about women. Gospel of Thomas, he's got Jesus promising to turn all the women into men. It's just crazy stuff. So one, they're bad. They're wrong. They're not written by an apostle. Secondly, they're late. The New Testament canon is closed. These books are coming along 3rd century, 4th century. Hundreds of years later, people are trying to say, hey, this is from Mary or Thomas, whatever. So here's what I say to people the last 10 years when people say, I'm worried that, how do we know we got the right books? Read the Gospels and then read whatever Gnostic Gospel you want to read. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. Read them. Right? You will decide for yourself that the Holy Spirit superintended the right books. We got the right books in the Bible. So, 1 John chapter 1, verse 1 writes against the Gnostics. That's why the Gnostic Gospels are not part of the New Testament. Have a good day.